The United States government owes $37 trillion. That's $111,964 for every person in America, $288,101 per household. The interest payment alone in 2024 was $900 billion, more than the entire defense budget, more than Medicare, more than most government services combined, and it's accelerating. By 2027, if interest rates stay at 5%, annual interest payments will hit $1.5 trillion. That's 6% of GDP just to service debt. Here's the problem. This debt is mathematically unpayable. You can't tax your way out. Confiscating every dollar from every billionaire in America wouldn't make a dent. You can't cut spending your way out. Eliminating the entire military wouldn't be enough. You can't grow your way out. You'd need 8% GDP growth for decades, which hasn't happened since World War II. So what's the plan? The government has one, and people believe it's not what they're telling you. They're not going to repay the debt. They're going to erase it. Not through default. That would destroy America's credit and collapse the dollar overnight. They're going to use a mechanism that's been deployed throughout history, most recently by the United States itself in 1933. It's called strategic reserve revaluation, and it's already begun. On January 23, 2025, President Trump signed an executive order establishing a strategic Bitcoin reserve. In December 2024, Senator Cynthia Lummis introduced the Bitcoin Act proposing the government acquire 1 million Bitcoin over 5 years. These aren't random policy moves. They're the opening plays in a debt reset strategy that will transfer wealth from savers to the government on a scale not seen since the Great Depression. Hey, I'm Brandon, and welcome back to My Money Mint. Today, I'm explaining a plan people believe the US government has to eliminate $37 trillion in debt without repaying a single dollar. I'll show you the historical precedent from 1933 when they did the exact same thing. I'll show you the math on how Bitcoin and gold revaluation destroys the dollar while saving the government. All right, let's get into it. Let's start with why the debt is actually unpayable. The US debt to GDP ratio is 132%, the highest in American history except World War II. We're adding roughly $2 trillion in new debt every year through deficits. The Congressional Budget Office projects will add another $2 trillion annually through 2034. That's $20 trillion in new debt over the next decade, bringing total debt to $57 trillion. But here's the killer. As old debt matures, it must be refinanced at current interest rates. When the government borrowed $10 trillion at 2% interest rates during the 2010s, it cost $200 billion annually. As that debt rolls over and gets refinanced at 5%, it will cost $500 billion annually. That's a $300 billion increase just from refinancing, not new borrowing. The average interest rate on total marketable debt is currently 3.393%. But trillions in Treasury securities mature every year and must be refinanced at whatever the current rate is. If rates stay at 5%, every $1 trillion that refinances adds $50 billion in annual interest costs. With $30 trillion in publicly held debt rolling over the next decade, we're looking at interest payments potentially exceeding $2 trillion per year by 2030. At that point, interest becomes the largest item in the federal budget. Larger than Social Security, larger than all of Medicare, larger than defense, education, infrastructure, and everything else. The government will be paying more to service debt than it spends on the entire rest of government operations. That's the definition of a debt spiral. So, what are the options? There are really only 5 ways to deal with unpayable debt. Default explicitly, announce you're not paying, take the credit hit, restructure. The US will never do this. It would destroy the dollar's reserve currency status overnight and collapse the global financial system. Pay it off through taxes and spending cuts. Mathematically impossible. You'd need to raise taxes by 40% and cut spending by 30% simultaneously for decades. No politician will do this. It's electoral suicide. Grow out of it. You'd need sustained 8% GDP growth while keeping debt growth at 0. We haven't seen growth like that since the 1950s, and we had unique advantages then. No global competition, massive post-war productivity, favorable demographics. Not happening now. Inflated away through financial repression. This is what happened after World War II. The government kept interest rates below inflation for 30 years. If you're earning 2% interest but inflation is 5%, you're losing 3% per year in real terms. Over 30 years, debt fell from 119% of GDP to 35%. But this only works in a closed economy with capital controls. Today, money is global. If investors sense this coming, they flee to other currencies. You'd need to impose capital controls preventing money from leaving the country. Possible, but difficult. Or option 5, strategic asset revaluation. This is what many think they're actually planning, and there's a perfect historical precedent. The United States did this exact thing in 1933. Imagine it's 1933, and the United States is drowning in debt from World War I and the Great Depression. Debt to GDP is 40%, unsustainable for the era. Gold has been officially priced at $20.67 per ounce since 1879. That's 54 years of the same price, locked in by law. On April 5th, 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102. It made private gold ownership illegal. Americans were required to turn in their gold to the government at the official price of $20.67 per ounce. Failure to comply meant 10 years in prison and a $10,000 fine, equivalent to $230,000 today. The government confiscated gold from citizens at $20.67 and gave them paper dollars in exchange. Then, on January 31st, 1934, Roosevelt signed the Gold Reserve Act. The government revalued gold from $20.67 to $35 per ounce. That's a 69% increase overnight. The government's gold reserves jumped from $4 billion to $6.8 billion in value. Not because they acquired more gold, they just changed the accounting price. What did this do? The real debt burden fell from 40% of GDP to 25% within 5 years. The government eliminated 15 percentage points of debt to GDP through pure accounting revaluation. But the citizens who turned in their gold at $20.67, they couldn't buy it back. It was illegal to own. They watched the government revalue the gold they'd been forced to sell, and they got nothing. And the dollars they received in exchange? Inflation surged through the 1930s and 1940s. By 1945, those dollars had lost 40% of their purchasing power. The citizens who complied lost twice, once when they sold gold at the artificially low price, and again when inflation destroyed the dollars they received. This is the blueprint. And it could be happening again right now with Bitcoin and gold. Let's start with Bitcoin. The US government currently holds approximately 210,000 Bitcoin. These weren't purchased, they were seized from criminal enterprises. Silk Road, Bitfinex, ransomware operations. At $100,000 per Bitcoin, that's $21 billion in current value. On January 23rd, 2025, Trump signed an executive order establishing a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Senator Lummis introduced the Bitcoin Act in December 2024, proposing the government acquire 1 million Bitcoin over 5 years. How will they acquire it? Not by buying on the open market. That would spike the price immediately and cost hundreds of billions. Instead, they'll use seizures from ongoing criminal investigations. They'll accept Bitcoin as payment for fines and penalties from crypto companies facing regulatory action. They might even mine Bitcoin using government-owned energy infrastructure. The key is accumulating quietly before announcing the revaluation. Here's the math. Acquire 1 million Bitcoin at an average cost of $120,000 per coin. That's $120 billion total. A lot of money, but manageable for the US government over 5 years. Then, once accumulated, announce that for strategic reserve purposes, Bitcoin is being valued at $1 million per coin on the government's balance sheet. Overnight, the balance sheet value jumps from $120 billion to $1 trillion. The government just created $880 billion in accounting value through a price change. And here's the critical part. The market will follow. When the US government, as the largest holder of Bitcoin, sets a floor price of $1 million, the market reprices accordingly. Bitcoin rises from $100,000 to $300,000 within months, then $500,000, then $800,000 over the next year, eventually approaching $1 million as the government's reserve valuation becomes the market reference point. The government didn't buy Bitcoin at $1 million. They bought it at $120,000 and then declared it worth $1 million. The market follows their lead because they're the 800-pound gorilla. Now let's talk about gold. The US officially holds 8,133 tons of gold, which equals 261 million ounces. At the current market price of $4,200 per ounce, that's worth nearly $1.1 trillion. But here's the interesting part. The government's book value for that gold is only $42.22 per ounce. That's the statutory price set in 1973 and never changed. On the government's balance sheet, the gold reserves are valued at just $11 billion. There's a $720 billion gap between the book value and the market value. This creates massive room for revaluation. The government could announce that for strategic reserve purposes, and to back the dollar, gold is now valued at $20,000 per ounce on the national balance sheet. At $20,000 per ounce, 261 million ounces equals $5.2 trillion. The government's gold reserves jump from 11 billion book value to $5.2 trillion. That's $5.2 trillion in new balance sheet value created through accounting revaluation. And just like Bitcoin, the market follows. If the US government values gold at $20,000, the global market reprices. Gold goes from $2,800 to $5,000, then $8,000, then $12,000, gradually moving toward the government's $20,000 valuation. Now here's the combined impact. 1 million Bitcoin valued at $1 million per coin equals $1 trillion. 261 million ounces of gold valued at $20,000 per ounce equals $5.2 trillion. Total new balance sheet value, $6.2 trillion. This offsets debt on the government's balance sheet and dramatically improves the debt to GDP ratio on paper. But the real magic, the real theft, happens to the dollar. When gold goes from $2,800 to $20,000, the dollar lost 85% of its value relative to gold. When Bitcoin goes from $100,000 to $1 million, the dollar lost 90% of its value relative to Bitcoin. Average those together, the dollar loses roughly 85% to 90% of its value versus hard assets. What does that mean in the real world? It means massive inflation. Not the 3% inflation we're used to. We're talking 20% to 30% annual inflation for 3 to 4 years. Food prices double, gas prices double, rent increases 60%, a gallon of milk that costs $4 today costs $8, a tank of gas that costs $60 costs $120. Your $2,000 rent becomes $3,200. If you have $100,000 in savings, it now buys what $35,000 bought before. You lost 65% of your purchasing power. That's not a hypothetical. That's the mathematical result of 85% dollar devaluation. And here's the key. The $37 trillion debt, it's still nominally $37 trillion. The government still owes $37 trillion in dollar terms. But after 85% devaluation, the real value of that debt is only $13 trillion in purchasing power terms. The government just erased $24 trillion in debt burden without repaying a single dollar. They stole it from creditors, savers, pension funds, bondholders, and anyone holding dollars. Now you might be thinking, wouldn't foreign creditors see this coming and dump US debt? That's the genius of the plan. Who holds US debt? Japan holds $1.06 trillion, but Japan has a 230% debt to GDP ratio themselves. They need the same reset. China holds $759 billion, down from over $1.3 trillion in 2010. China has been diversifying for years, but they also have $18.7 trillion in debt and need a reset. The largest holders of US debt aren't foreign governments anyway. It's Americans. Mutual funds hold $4.5 trillion. Banks hold $1.9 trillion. State and local governments hold $1.7 trillion. Pension funds hold nearly $1 trillion. The Federal Reserve holds $4.6 trillion. Total domestic holdings are around $20 trillion out of $30 trillion in publicly held debt. When the reset happens, Americans holding bonds lose 70% in real terms, but they can't flee because where would they go? The euro has the same problems. EU debt is massive. The yen, Japan's debt to GDP is 230%. The yuan, not freely convertible, and China is also preparing a reset. There's nowhere to hide in fiat currency. And here's the international dimension that makes this even more inevitable. Central banks globally are buying gold at record levels. In 2022 and 2023, central banks purchased over 2,000 tons of gold, the most since 1950. China officially holds 2,300 tons, but estimates suggest 4,000 to 6,000 tons. Russia holds 2,300 tons. India holds 840 tons and is buying more. Why? They're preparing for exactly this. They're tired of dollar dominance. They're tired of the US exporting inflation to the rest of the world through money printing. They want an alternative. When the US revalues gold to $20,000, every central bank's gold reserves revalue proportionally. China's gold jumps from $630 billion to $4.5 trillion. Russia's reserves jump similarly. Everyone's debt devalues simultaneously. This isn't explicit coordination, but it's aligned incentives. Every major government has unpayable debt. Everyone benefits from a coordinated reset through asset revaluation. The US moves first because the dollar is the reserve currency. Other nations follow because they have no choice. The market reprices globally. Let me walk you through the timeline as I see it unfolding. 2025 is the accumulation phase. The US quietly acquires Bitcoin through seizures and strategic purchases. They don't announce totals. They don't make market purchases that spike prices. The narrative builds around gold backing, sound money, and strategic reserves, but they're just positioning. 2026 is the crisis phase. There will be a severe debt ceiling fight, potentially a near default or government shutdown. Bond market stress, yield spike, confidence waivers. The crisis creates justification for extraordinary measures. Politicians will say we need bold action to preserve American financial stability. This sets up the 2027 revaluation. 2027 is the reset. The government announces the strategic Bitcoin reserve is operational. They have acquired 1 million Bitcoin, valued at $1 million per coin. Simultaneously, they announce a partial return to gold backing. Gold is revalued to $20,000 per ounce for reserve purposes. This is marketed as stabilizing the currency, restoring confidence, ensuring American leadership in the digital age. Bitcoin rises to $1 million over 12 to 18 months. Gold rises to $20,000 over the same period. The dollar loses 70% of its purchasing power. Inflation explodes 30% to 50% in the first year. Food triples in price. Energy quadruples. Housing doubles nominally. We experience stagflation, high inflation, combined with low growth and 8% to 10% unemployment. The $37 trillion debt, adjusted for the 70% currency devaluation, is now worth roughly $12 trillion in real terms. The government erased $25 trillion in debt burden without defaulting. By 2028 to 2030, things stabilize. Bitcoin settles around $500,000 to $800,000. Gold settles around $15,000 to $18,000. The dollar stabilizes at its new, much lower purchasing power. The reset is complete. Who wins? The US government. They erased $25 trillion in real debt without default. Politicians. They avoided the pain of tax increases and spending cuts. Early Bitcoin holders who bought at $30,000 and sell at $1 million. Early gold holders who bought at $800 and sell at $20,000. Foreign governments with gold reserves, China, Russia, India, they erase their debts too using the same mechanism. The wealthy class, their assets inflate nominally. Real estate values double. Stock portfolios surge in nominal terms. Business values increase. They preserve wealth through hard assets. Who loses? The middle class. Savings in dollars evaporate. A $200,000 retirement account becomes worth $70,000 in purchasing power. Retirees on fixed incomes, Social Security payments don't keep up with 30% annual inflation. Their standard of living collapses. Bondholders, repaid in devalued dollars, they lose 70% of real value. Pension funds holding massive government bonds watch their portfolios become nearly worthless in real terms. Workers, wages don't keep up with inflation. Real wages fall 40% to 50%. Renters, rents rise with inflation, but wages don't. Homelessness spikes. Small businesses, they can't raise prices fast enough. Profit margins collapse. Anyone holding dollar-denominated bonds or fixed income assets gets destroyed. This pattern has repeated throughout history. Weimar Germany in the 1920s, printed money, hyperinflation, debt erased. Argentina multiple times in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s. Devalued the peso, savings evaporated, debt disappeared. Zimbabwe in the 2000s, printed money, hyperinflation, debt gone. Venezuela in the 2000s and 10s, printed bolivars, hyperinflation, debt eliminated. The pattern is always the same. Government becomes over-indebted. Government devalues currency. Savers lose everything. Government survives. It's happened dozens of times in the past century. It's about to happen in America. So what do you do? First, understand that this is legal theft. It's policy theft. It's morally wrong, but it's happening regardless of your principles. You have a choice. Be morally outraged and financially destroyed, or be morally aware and financially positioned. The government doesn't care about your principles. They care about their survival. You need to adapt or get destroyed. Here's the debt paradox people misunderstand. Conventional wisdom says if the dollar devalues, Debt is good because you repay it with cheaper dollars. That's true for the government because they can print money. But for individuals, it's wrong. Your debt is in dollars, but your income is also in dollars. Your wages don't keep up with inflation. You can't print money, only the government can. Pay off high interest debt immediately, credit cards, personal loans, car loans. The one exception is fixed rate mortgages at 3% to 4%. Those you can keep because they will inflate away. If you have a $300,000 mortgage at 3.5% and inflation runs 25% annually for 3 years, that mortgage becomes trivial in real terms. But adjustable rate mortgages or high fixed rates, pay those off. The evidence that this is happening is overwhelming. Debt to GDP is 132%. That's a fact. Interest payments are $900 billion annually and increasing. That's a fact. The debt is mathematically unpayable through conventional means. That's mathematical reality. Historical precedent exists. The US did this exact thing in 1933. Executive orders have been signed, January 2025. Bills have been introduced, the Bitcoin Act in December 2024. Central banks are buying record amounts of gold, over 2,000 tons in 2022 and 2023. China is accumulating Bitcoin through state enterprises. Russia is stockpiling gold and reducing dollar reserves. BRICS nations are creating alternative payment systems. Governments with intelligence agencies and unlimited resources are preparing for this. Why aren't you? And here's how they'll market it. They won't call it money printing. They'll call it strategic reserve revaluation. They won't call it currency debasement. They'll call it restoring gold-backed dollar stability. They won't call it theft. They'll call it necessary policy to preserve American financial stability and leadership. The gold backing will sound conservative, sound money, a return to the gold standard. But here's the trick. You can't back the dollar with gold at $4,200 per ounce. At current prices, US gold reserves would only back 3.5% of the M2 money supply. That's not backing, that's tokenism. But revalue gold to $20,000 per ounce, and suddenly you have $5.2 trillion in reserves. That backs 25% of M2. Now you can market it as a partial return to sound money principles. It sounds fiscally conservative, it sounds responsible, but the reality is a 7 times gold revaluation that destroys the dollar by 85%. This is the secret plan. It's not hidden in the sense that the mechanisms are invisible. Executive Order 6102 is public record. The 1933 gold revaluation is documented history. The current executive orders and proposed legislation are publicly available. But it's secret in the sense that almost no one is connecting the dots. Almost no one understands what's actually happening. The government is going to eliminate $37 trillion in debt by destroying the currency. They're going to transfer wealth from savers to the state on a scale not seen in 90 years. And they're going to market it as sound money policy, fiscal responsibility, and American financial leadership. The only question is whether you're going to be positioned on the right side of this transfer or the wrong side. Because it's coming. The math doesn't lie. The debt is unpayable. The historical precedent exists. The mechanism is being assembled right now. The timeline is 2025 to 2027. You have maybe 18 to 24 months to position yourself. After that, it's too late. The revaluation happens, the inflation explodes, and your purchasing power evaporates. Don't let that happen. Get out of dollars. Get into hard assets. Protect yourself and your family. Because when this happens, the government won't save you. They're the ones stealing from you. Thank you for watching My Money Mint. If this breakdown of America's potential secret debt reset strategy got you thinking about how to protect your wealth, smash that subscribe button. Let me know in the comments. Are you positioned for this, or are you still holding dollars? I'll see you in the next one.